One of the things I often think about is have we done too good a job at Holocaust education? And what I mean by that is we've there's been such a focus on Holocaust education that anti-Semitism sometimes has been tied to that, meaning that people don't see the bigger picture of the history of anti-Semitism. They think it started the Holocaust, it ended the Holocaust, and like that was it. That was the moment of anti-Semitism.
I'm sitting here looking at a high school history textbook. It's typical, a National Geographic publication covering world history from antiquity to the modern era in a cool 1,200 pages spread out over 2 volumes. Probably the sort of book used in sophomore and junior year history classes all over the country. It has 5 pages on the Holocaust, 2 of which are mostly graphics. And from what I can tell, there's nothing else about anti Semitism in the book, and certainly nothing about the ancient roots of that hatred. I'm not surprised. If you've listened to me before, you know my feelings about textbooks. They're the epitome of curriculums that have been called a mile wide and an inch deep. And yet, you just heard that provocative quote from today's guest, wondering if perhaps we've taught the Holocaust too well, if we've overemphasized it to the point where Americans today can't distinguish the broader lessons of anti-Semitism from the Holocaust. Maybe all of that despite those textbooks? Anne Frank's diary certainly plays a big role in many schools. And think of Holocaust movies like Schindler's List and The Pianist, and even more recent entries like The Book Thief and the novel it was based on. Anyway, welcome to What's the Big Idea? I'm your host, Dan Carney. In light of recent events concerning former President Trump and Kanye West, and a report from the Anti-Defamation League showing a continued uptick in anti-Semitism across the U.S., I wanted to dig into this question of Holocaust education, and more broadly, if we're addressing anti-Semitic hatred. I contacted Facing History and Ourselves, truly the gold standard for education resources and professional development in social studies and ELA around hard topics like anti-Semitism. Please check the show notes for links to their amazing stuff. They put me in touch with Rabbi Yehuda Potok.
So I'm Yehuda Potok. I've been in education for over 2 decades. Started in schools, was head of school for about 12 years, and then joined Facing History about a year and a half ago, where I'm now the director of the Jewish Education Program and the project lead for the Contemporary Anti-Semitism project that we're currently involved in.
I really enjoyed this conversation. Something I've long wrestled with as an educator is the difference between knowing and understanding, between learning and internalizing, between pointing out places on a map and being able to use the map, so to speak. History is in part a tool for comprehending the present, and yet the owner's manual for that tool doesn't need to be a 1,200-page long textbook. It does, however, need to be something that guides us to a deeper understanding. And so I started out our conversation by asking Yehuda about that organization that he works with, Facing History.
Facing History is an organization that has been around for over 4 decades and has really tried to use case studies of history to help students understand the importance of their choices, to emotionally engage them in the history that has been involved with hatred and bigotry, to help them understand that choices really matter. We've built many resources over the past number of years and trained teachers to use them in bringing them to their classrooms. We've reached hundreds of thousands of students over the past 40 years.
Yeah, I've used Facing History's resources quite a bit, and it's really outstanding material for any teacher looking to extend beyond textbooks and sort of the standard materials that we're given. I want to start with sort of big picture cultural, well-documented. The Anti-Defamation League and others have documented now a 5+ year uptick in anti-Semitism. What do you see driving that? And let's just start there, and then I want to kind of talk about where education fits into that story.
Sure. So, I mean, Jews have been stereotyped and scapegoated and physically and verbally abused for thousands of years. It didn't start with the Holocaust. It didn't end with the Holocaust. And like other forms of race-based hatred, anti-Semitism is in part an ideology that can be weaponized to a variety of ends. Persists across political spectrum, national borders, age, education levels, and demographic markers, even in communities without Jewish populations. Phyllis Goldstein wrote in Inconvenient Hatred, which is actually a Facing History publication. She said that, like other hatreds, anti-Semitism is almost always a current event, one that is triggered by the fears and anxieties of the moment. And I think that, based on what's going on in our world today and within our own country, a lot of those fears and anxieties that exist for a variety of reasons gain a target. And those are generally minorities, and Jews have often been the target of that.
Yeah, I read somewhere that anti-Semitism is sometimes referred to as the canary in the coal mine. That when you see an uptick, you see an upswing, it's an indication of a larger societal rot or hatred that's growing. Do you think that it's a well understood concept that anti-Semitism has deep historical roots? It's not simply something that was a product of Nazism and the Holocaust?
So interestingly, I know that it's not. It's not well known because, or I should say, it's not known by all. Let's put it that way, because we've been running these mini courses around anti-Semitism, and we've had educators on the calls who have openly told us that they didn't realize how the whole history of where it came from and the roots of anti-Semitism, particularly within the Christian roots of anti-Semitism. And so that's what we're doing in the Facing History. We're trying to educate and help teachers understand the long history of it and to understand the different manifestations that have occurred over time, but the tropes that run through that history and continue to persist today.
So if someone's listening right now and they're thinking, oh, actually, I'm one of those, I didn't know that. I don't need to trace the whole history of it here, but what is one important idea to understand about those deep historical roots?
I think an idea to understand about this form of hatred is that it uses certain themes throughout time, and those same themes come up again and again, but morph slightly and are used a little bit differently depending on the context and the time period. And when someone can begin to understand and see those original tropes, and then take a close look at things that are in the media today or things that they're being exposed to today or hearing in conversations, they begin to understand the connection between those ancient tropes and the current manifestations that exist. And I think that's really the key, to really be in tune to how old forms of hate continue to evolve and be reused in current times.
When you work with schools, you work with teachers on developing, growing Holocaust education curriculum, where do you start? How do you lay a foundation for a curriculum that's going to create a deep understanding of the causes and effects and human behavior of the Holocaust?
Sure. So at Facing History, we always start with ourselves. I mean, that's why we're called Facing History and Ourselves. The understanding of oneself and one's own identity and how that identity interplays and interacts with other identities and other people around us is so critical. If a person doesn't understand their own identity and who they are and where they fit into the greater whole, it becomes very hard to begin to have a conversation around how we then interact with the other and how we interact with others around us. So first we start with ourselves, and then we begin to move into the we they, right? In other words, how our groups formed. Not necessarily a bad thing, right? Groups are also important for social support, but they also can result in negative interactions where it's the us versus them, right? So first understanding oneself to then understand how that self is part of a group and to understand how that group interplays with other groups and other people around.
Could you talk for a second about this idea of the other, which is so important in, as you say, understanding group dynamics, human behavior, and it's just a recurring idea in all human interaction, all human history. How does Facing History describe and help students understand the other?
The other is not necessarily a bad thing innately, right? In other words, there's always the other, right? There's myself and there's my group, and then there's the people who are not necessarily part of that group. I think the challenge becomes when people start to other, right? In other words, to make people into a distinct or separate category from oneself, where they see someone outside of them as being either evil or having negative traits, and begins to stereotype those individuals. That's where it really becomes problematic. So I think that what we try to do is to help the teachers work with students to understand when students are thinking of the other as really an other, right? To dehumanize them and to begin to take away their humanity and to devalue them. And that's when the student needs to sort of check themselves and think about what choices they're making in their interactions with others.
As a teacher and as a history teacher, I've long wrestled with the difference between helping students gain knowledge but also helping them gain dispositions and attitudes. And the difference between, you can understand something, you can know something, but if you are not personally changed by that learning, by that understanding, then that knowledge could largely be lost, or even worse, could be misused at some point. How do you approach that in the development of Holocaust curriculum? As you've kind of already alluded to it, with starting with the ourselves, the layer of students need to understand, they need to know what happened leading up to and during the Holocaust, but also getting them to internalize the larger lessons. uh, how do you approach that?
So in addition to the scope and sequence of starting with ourselves and kind of moving to we, they, and kind of working around there, we also have at the core of everything we do, we have what we call our pedagogic triangle. Our pedagogic triangle is made up of those three points, right? It's intellectual rigor, it's emotional engagement, and it's ethical reflection. Intellectual rigor means that everything that we do is based on historical cases, the facts and understanding like what happened. And that's, for the head, right? For the student to really grapple with the intellectual curiosity and understanding of what happened. But you can't leave it there, because like then what? Like it's either something that happened in the past, so it's not relevant to me, or it's just an intellectual endeavor to like talk about this idea. So what we do is we really try to bring it to the emotional engagement stage of having students be able to reflect on what that history means in connection to their own personal lives in our world today, right? And making those connections and helping them make those connections to things that are not only going on for themselves personally in their own lives locally, but also globally, and thinking about what is happening in current events. We have a lot of current events resources, and helping make those connections for students that similar to what either happened in the Holocaust or in other genocides in the past, many of those types of things continue to exist in this world today. And how can a student think about their own lives in relationship to the choices that they make, the voice that they use, the way that they are able to make it more personal to their and connect to their own lives. From there, we then move into the ethical reflection, right? So it's also not enough just to live in the heart of that emotional engagement of saying, okay, it's meaningful because I understand it connects to my life, but then what? Like, what do I do with it, right? And the ethical reflection is really about helping the student think about what choices they make, right? I keep talking about choices. It's such a critical piece of facing history. We want the students to be reflecting on the ethical decisions that they're encountering, often daily, right? On a regular basis throughout their lives, even to the point of like, what joke do I tell, or what words come out of my mouth, or, how do I engage with, the local politicians to be able to pursue something that I feel, is unjust. And all of that pedagogic triangle, all those 3 points is focused then in on civic agency, of trying to help our students gain civic agency and finding their civic voice.
And that's it. That's the trick as a teacher. How do you get your students to want to take action on what they've learned?
Right.
It Facing history says people make choices, choices make history. And those, as you just alluded to, helping students make ethical choices is perhaps the peak of our work as teachers. I read somewhere you told a story about a rabbi who carried around 2 pieces of paper in his pocket. Could you tell that story?
Absolutely. So there's a famous story of a rabbi who carried as you said, 2 pieces of paper in the pocket. And the one pocket, I won't give the quote exactly, but to the degree that I am nothing but dust of the earth, right? It's sort of like I'm worthless. I'm not really worth anything in the grand scheme of the universe. What does my life mean? And in the other pocket, he had a note that said, "I'm everything. I'm so important. I'm the world." Right. So, and this is the idea within Jewish thinking of the fact that we're supposed to be humble and have humility and understand that it's true in the grand scheme of the universe. Like I'm a speck. I'm like one little dot in the universe, and at the same time, that little dot is incredibly important to our world because everything that I do has an impact on other people. And in fact, there is a saying within the Talmud that says that if you destroy one life, it's as if you destroyed an entire world, right? Every life in this universe is incredibly important because of the impact that we have on not just the people immediately around us, but the ripple effect that we have on our entire world. There's a different story that comes up also that's told where there was a different rabbi who was trying to figure out at a young age of how to affect the world, right? Like, how can I have an impact on the greater world? So he really tried to figure out and have an impact on the greater world. And then he realized he couldn't have an impact on the greater world. So he tried to figure out how to have an impact on his country, couldn't succeed, had to have an impact on his town, really wasn't so successful, had to have an impact on his family. And he felt like he still wasn't really getting it. And then he realized it was how to have impact on myself. And if I can think about changing myself, I can then thereby have an impact on my family, which will have an impact on my town, which will have an impact on the world, right, on the country and the world. So it's, we are incredibly important. We're not really that important, and yet at the same time we're incredibly important because we do have that ability to have massive impact on the people around us in our world.
That second story, it's like he did the facing history model in reverse.
Exactly. Well, it kind of started one way and then went backwards and went back
Right, yeah.
again. So yes,
Right, sure.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, what's the state of Holocaust education in this country today? Which maybe is a very broad question because we are such a decentralized education system. But if you had to give in some broad strokes, how are we doing?
Yeah, so I think there's a recognition, especially because of the rise in contemporary antisemitism, there's a recognition of the continued need for this type of education. I do think that in some ways we've been very successful because the schools and places that are actually teaching it are often teaching it pretty effectively to help students really connect to and understand what's connecting that past to the present and thinking about the future. It's becoming a little bit more challenging with Holocaust survivors passing away, and that those testimonies and voices that have been a real central piece of Holocaust education are being lost in the face-to-face, and I think that is where there's a lot of Holocaust educators thinking about, like, what next? How do we deal with that reality? But at the same time, one of the things I often think about is, have we done too good a job at Holocaust education? What I mean by that is there's been such a focus on Holocaust education that anti-Semitism sometimes has been tied to that, meaning that people don't see the bigger picture of the history of anti-Semitism. They think it started at the Holocaust, it ended at the Holocaust, and like that was it. That was the moment of anti-Semitism. And so I think one of the challenges of the Contemporary Anti-Semitism project that I'm working on is helping teachers get that bigger scope and understanding of what anti-Semitism is about.
Yeah, I found that even just in the recent events with Kanye and former President Trump and talking with students about it, this is something that they're seeing in their social media world and recognizing even among those students that had a pretty good understanding of the Holocaust, not really seeing that
Right.
connection, not realizing like, oh well, but that was something that happened then. This is a different thing, and those through lines they miss out. How about the role of misinformation on social media? Sticking with that subject, or just in society in general, I was reading about some grassroots efforts to create Holocaust curriculums in the 1960s and 70s. Some teachers in the Northeast, and it was interesting. This article saying that one of the things that motivated them was they were hearing lots of misinformation about anti-Semitism, about the Holocaust, and here we are in 2023 facing the same thing.
So misinformation is not something new, right? It's just information is faster and more global. I think that's really the challenge that we're seeing today. So with online social media platforms, it's harder to contain it. It's something that really is, something goes out there and it just spreads like wildfire. Um, but there are tools and skills that we teach students that we want students to understand how to think critically about what it is that they're encountering. Um, so that when they see a news piece or when they see a meme that comes across their social media feed, to not just flip through it and just kind of like mindlessly, absorb and kind of move on, but to really take the time to actually think about what's the perspective of what you're what's the perspective that's being taken in this piece. Who's the author? What is the author's intent behind what they're trying to portray here? What are they trying to accomplish by what they're writing and what they're saying? uh, Doing fact checks and kind of like looking at other sources to see whether or not this is accurate or not. So there's many skills that students can learn of how to do this, but it requires students to slow down, which in today's day and age is very hard, because most of the times when you're going through social media or you're looking through news or you're using online stuff, you're just flying through it. And we all do it, adults too. It's not just kids, right? This is all of us. But it really does require that slowing down and being intentional and being a critical reader and thinker.
What are some things that, when we're talking to our students about exactly that, about being careful on social media and slowing down and not reposting, retweeting everything that jumps out at them, what are some red flags that students should be looking for when we're talking about anti-Semitism, misrepresentation of things, misinformation, disinformation? Are there some recurring red flags that you see that are the hallmarks of this that people should be looking out for?
Yeah, for sure. I think that one of the reasons why we teach the history of anti-Semitism and the history of racism is to help students understand what those ideas look like, feel like, sound like, so that when they see something in current media, they're more attuned to picking up on those same sounds, feels, and looks, right? If you understand the anti-Semitic tropes of the past that have existed for thousands of years, whether it's accusations of deicide or global power and control of Jews and all those conspiracies and those tropes that exist, if you have an understanding of those, when you see an image or when you read an article that begins to hint towards that, you students will often then stop themselves and begin to really think about, like, wait, what did that just say? And then carefully think about like what it actually is that was expressed in this article or the image that they saw. There's actually one of the exercises we do in one of our contemporary anti-Semitism units is we match up a modern meme that came out during COVID with a propaganda piece that was put out in Nazi Germany and a painting that was from Christian Middle Ages, right? And like you can see the evolution of many themes but one of which had to do with like Jews being infectious and like a virus, and you can see the image evolve over time. But if you don't know that history and you don't understand where it came from, you'll never recognize it in the current form. So again, it's sort of helping students understand where the racial and the anti-Semitic images, ideas, thoughts come from, so they can begin to have that in mind as they're reading and seeing current pieces.
I want to ask you about joy and optimism in these curriculums. I've often found with when you're teaching hard history, whether it's the Holocaust, slavery, genocides, we're naturally attracted to the really tough stuff, the hard stuff, the almost, I would say, victim story. How can we Where can we find those points of joy and optimism so that students don't feel um, like the entire story's tragedy? There's little hope.
So I'm really glad you brought that up. And I think one of the challenges with so much, we're being hit daily by story after story of violence and of hatred, and we can get swallowed up by it. We can drown in it. And I think it's critical. And again, going back to that idea of starting with ourselves, it's critical for us to be helping students find joy in their own identity and to be able to express their own identity and to be able to share their own identity. I think that that's a really powerful piece, which is one of the reasons why we start there, right? To have a grounded understanding of like, who am I? Like, what is the joy of my family and my traditions and my culture and my religion? Like, what is that for me, and how can I carry that with me on a daily basis? Because if you don't have that as a starting point, you will get swallowed up by the hatred and the bigotry. it's really hard to be in this stuff without having a sense of self and having sort of that strong sense of who I am, and finding community around that, and finding others who share in those identities and share in that joy of culture. It's not easy to do, but if we focus too much on all the bad stuff and we don't think about the joy of identity and like our heritage and where we come from. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why Facing History in our seminal work of Holocaust and Human Behavior, we talk about life before the war, right? Because it's not just about the devastation. We talk about the communities that existed prior to that, and the incredible history that existed before the destruction. The Jews of Poland extends that even more. Some of the new work that's coming out right now, it focuses on the beauty of the lives, not just the devastation that happened to those lives. Yes, it's because we also want to humanize the people and help people understand like what the devastation really meant, but it's also because it's so important to see that beauty, and to recognize that beauty, and to understand that there's this incredible heritage and there's incredible culture that exists. And then we also then have to deal with the hate and the bigotry, but we have to have that groundedness.
Reminds me of something I read recently. Some Holocaust educator, I think, was writing about there's been maybe an overemphasis on Jews are just like everyone else. Jews are just like everyone else. This idea that we humans have done this to ourselves, and that we should be able to look at each other and see the similarities. But actually, by doing so, we've lost a, a view of what was lost during the Holocaust. Like you said, the rich culture that existed in these communities before the war.
Yeah, we talk all the time in Facing History about the idea of the universal versus the particular, right? There are particular things that every group and every individual has about them that's special and different. And then there are universal themes and messages that we carry forward, right? So with anything, whether it's positive or negative, right, we always want to make sure that we see both of those aspects. We want to see the particular of the individual and the communities and the people that we're talking about, but we also want to be thinking about universal messages that we can carry into other spaces, into other frames.
You've referenced a couple times the current project you're working on, an anti-Semitism curriculum, I think, or anti-Semitism project.
Correct.
Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so we are in the middle of a 3-year project, developing resources. Again, we have the Holocaust Human Behavior, but the idea of the Contemporary Anti-Semitism Project is to update what we have around anti-Semitism itself, and to really begin to help teachers and students understand the current manifestations of anti-Semitism in our world today, and to help them understand, and to gain tools around the history of where anti-Semitism came from, to then be able to think about how it impacts our lives today and where it's showing up, how to spot it. Once you recognize it, what do you do about that? We have lessons that address online hate and online anti-Semitism, and how to react and respond to that. We have a variety of lessons of understanding the historical tropes of anti-Semitism, and then kind of flashing forward to like how those tropes are being used today, whether it's in media or in memes or other places. The gaming world is big for kids today, helping students recognize and see where it shows up in that context. Holocaust distortion and denial is still a big issue that exists out there, and trying to help students understand how that comes out and plays out. So we're really trying to think about anti-Semitism in the now, then developing these resources to provide to teachers they can use in their classrooms, to help students really recognize it when they see it, and then think about how to respond and what to do about it when they encounter it.
And Facing History has an incredible uh, bank of resources. And for someone that's listening and maybe is intrigued and wants to get started, where do they start? What's the best way to enter the world of Facing History and the rich resources you have?
Wow. So we have a workshop which is called Explorations, which really is a great entry point for any educator who wants to understand the sort of the way that Facing History thinks about education and education against hatred and bigotry, and like how we do this work. So that's a great place to start. We also have Teaching for Equity and Justice, which kind of gives a sort of a way of thinking about how I engage as an educator, with an equity justice lens. And then, as I said before, there's our seminal work of the Holocaust and Human Behavior, which is a very powerful resource, and really expansive. And it's actually even being updated to be even more expansive, to include more voices within history. And then some of our contemporary anti-Semitism resources, things like exploring anti-Semitic tropes. We have an explainer on anti-Semitism and its impacts. We have resources in our contemporary anti-Semitism resources that directly address the online hate issues and influencers, and how influencers play into hate and bigotry and anti-Semitism. We have and there is a landing page that we have for Facing History for contemporary anti-Semitism. So if you're interested in that, you can look at the 21st century contemporary anti-Semitism page, which has a whole list of resources and actually kind of takes you through unit by unit of like how you can kind of get into the conversation with your students through a progression of looking at the history and then kind of moving it forward into modern times.
Yeah, it's really outstanding stuff. And as you mentioned earlier, Facing History is always looking to make the connection to the present. And
Always.
no matter what's happened, even just what happened here in Los Angeles over the weekend, Facing History was immediately supplying teachers with resources for having those conversations.
Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah,
well,
making it relevant for kids' lives. That's the key. Making it relevant for kids' lives to help them make those connections.
Well, thanks so much for your work. Intrigued by your new project, and I want to thank you for joining me to talk about this important stuff today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
A huge thanks to Yehuda for joining me to talk about this vital topic, this unfortunately vital topic in 2023. I hope he gave you something to think about, particularly that anti-Semitism and the Holocaust are a real opportunity to help students not just know about history, but to understand it. And please check out the show notes. I've put links to some of their incredible resources. And if you're not a teacher that uses Facing History yet, I really encourage you to take some time to dig into what they have, especially their professional development that will help jumpstart some real changes to your curriculum. If you're a teacher who finds that you're struggling with how to address some hard topics, especially in history and ELA, my gosh, Facing History is where it's at. So please check them out. And huge thanks for listening today. Really appreciate it. If you've made it this far in the podcast and you're still listening to my voice, thanks for listening to a really important guest today on an essential topic. Hope everyone's doing well out there. As always, comments and questions are greatly appreciated on Twitter and Instagram at BigIdeaEd. Take care, everybody. Tune in next time.